Hey everyone. So I decided to talk about prompt one and to discuss the importance of the press during the American Revolution. So I do think that they played an important part, a big role in the American Revolution, both leading up to it and then also during it. What I really love about this part that we've been learning about in class is that the press were just such rebels at the time, and it's really interesting to think about them as rebels and how this was really a radical thing that they were doing. I think that it's also interesting that we're thinking about how media affected society at this time. In a lot of our classes, we do talk about media effects. So we look at maybe how gender representation in the media affects society, or violent movies and TV shows and video games and how that has an effect on society. But to think about how big of an effect they had at this time, for how different the media was than it is now, and maybe how it is now, they wouldn't have even been able to spread this kind of message, and to have such a similar message, because things are so much more fragmented now. But I do think it's really cool, and so yeah, that's why I wanted to talk about this today. So I'm going to start with just from the beginning. Leading up to the American Revolution, there was the Stamp Act. And on page, 53, it said, our textbook says, it was in the conflict over the Stamp Act that newspapers discovered a new role to play. And to me, that role ultimately was to be a watchdog for society, which is an important role that I feel like we place on the media now, is to to observe our politicians and to report to our country kind of what's going on so that we can stay in the know. And that's basically what they were doing. The press looked at the Stamp Act as being something that was unfair, and they didn't want to comply with it. They widely opposed the Stamp Act, and they really gathered together around this opposition, which just amplified their voices. I think that our textbook referred to them as a mass medium on page 56, which is what we call the media now, mass media. And they forced basically for the repeal of the act because they didn't comply. Now, after that, moving on, there was also John Dickinson's letters that were published, which was played a role in leading up to the Revolution. There was also the revival of Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die snake cartoon. So that was published out there at this time as well. And then there was a lot of leadership at the Boston Gazette during this time, and they were regularly writing articles that were promoting American independence and opposing Great Britain. So I know that the press was really different at this time. It was really individuals who decided to publish their opinions on things. But they did take on this role of becoming a government watchdog and holding the government accountable. So I really see these kind of radical and rebellious acts of breaking the law or publishing things anonymously to avoid being accused of breaking the law. But they really just wanted to be treated fairly. and they thought that society deserved to be treated fairly. That's what John Dickinson's letters were about as well, whenever there were import taxes put on the colonists. So, yeah, they were really trying to look out for society, and this was really an ideological kind of battle between the press and Great Britain. So during the war, the press played a huge part in communicating information to everyone. So they were trying to keep everybody engaged, keep everyone informed, which we all want to be informed, right? If our country is in war, or there are large things going on that really affect the majority of the country, we want to know. We want to be told what's going on. And they saw that as important during this time. So they were regularly releasing news stories. They were sharing, like, hey, we won this battle. Like, we can do this. We're going to win this war. And they wanted to keep everyone confident in this dream of becoming independent. So they were also framing stories to be very anti Great Britain at the time. So they might have posted something. I think it says the whining king of Great Britain, which is to describe King George, and that's on page 63 of our textbook. So they were really trying to keep society bought into this idea. I really see this as kind of this widespread movement. I was trying to think of an event that happened recently, something very current that related to this idea. And all I could think of, our media now is really different than how it was back then. And I just thought of all these marches and protests that happen now. So things like the Women's March, or the March for Life, or the March for Science. The marches themselves are really creating a narrative, creating a message, and sharing it so that people will buy it. And I can only speak on my own experience with the Women's March and the information that I've gotten from them, that they communicate regularly to keep people motivated, and talking about different maybe legislation that they were trying to push, and basically sharing wins, right? They want people to stay motivated and to feel like, hey, we are making a difference. And I feel like at the time, that's what the press was doing as well. So I wanted to also just share briefly on page 54, so I'm kind of going back a little bit. I love how it talks about how the press was such an important source for historians. And I guess I never really thought about it before, but I mentioned it to my husband. He was like, oh yeah, he definitely, as a history student, had to read a lot of different news articles and writings of their time period, so to gather information. But I do think it's interesting how newspapers play an important role, not only just in their own time, but also for understanding later on. So us now, what's happening now, I think it's interesting to think about decades from now. There will be people analyzing newspapers or tweets, I guess, but things that were written about our time period, and they're just trying to understand what was going on. Well, that's really all that I wanted to cover, and I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's discussions. Thanks.